One week after Sarah Harrison video went viral around the world, Marcus Thompson arrived at his guard post to find a completely transformed scene. Instead of tourists looking for entertainment, he was greeted by dozens of people who had come specifically to show their respect and gratitude for his military service and sacrifice. Veterans from across the United Kingdom had traveled to London just to salute Marcus and shake his hand during his breaks from guard duty. Old soldiers who had served in World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and the Falklands came to pay their respects to a younger warrior who had carried on their tradition of courage and dedication to protecting others. Families began bringing flowers, thank you cards, and small gifts to leave near Marcus' post. Children drew pictures of soldiers and heroes to give to the man who had risked his life to protect people he had never met. The pile of tributes grew larger each day as more people learned about his story and wanted to express their appreciation. Queen Elizabeth herself had been following the story through her staff and requested a private meeting with Marcus at Buckingham Palace. During their conversation, she personally thanked him for his service both in Afghanistan and as a member of the Royal Guard. The Queen expressed her regret that he had been treated poorly by tourists and assured him that his sacrifice was deeply valued by the royal family and the entire nation. The meeting with the Queen was kept private out of respect for Marcus' privacy, but word of the royal recognition spread throughout the military community. Marcus' commanding officers were impressed by the positive attention his story had brought to the armed forces and decided to promote him to a more senior position within the Royal Guard unit. Marcus' new role included training younger guards and serving as a liaison between the military and civilian communities. His experience with both combat operations and dealing with public interaction made him uniquely qualified to help other veterans transition into ceremonial duties while maintaining the high standards expected of the Royal Guard. George Harrison and his granddaughter, Sarah, became close friends with Marcus and continued advocating for better treatment of military veterans. George shared his own experiences from World War II to help Marcus understand that his struggles with post-traumatic stress were normal and nothing to be ashamed of. The friendship between the two veterans from different generations became a source of strength for both men. Sarah used her journalism skills to write articles about veteran mental health and the importance of supporting service members when they return home from deployment. Her original video had opened doors for her career, and she dedicated herself to telling stories that made a positive difference in people's lives rather than just seeking viral content for entertainment. The American college students who had harassed Marcus eventually reached out through social media to offer a sincere public apology. They admitted that they had been ignorant about military service and promised to educate themselves about the sacrifices made by veterans. Their apology was widely shared and helped demonstrate that people can learn and grow from their mistakes. Marcus' story became part of the training program for new Royal Guards to help them understand the importance of their role and the diverse backgrounds of the people who serve in ceremonial positions. Military leaders used his experience as an example of how combat veterans can successfully transition to different types of service while continuing to honor their commitment to duty. The incident also led to changes in how tourists are educated about the Royal Guard and British military traditions. New signs and information displays were installed around Buckingham Palace to help visitors understand that the Guards are active military personnel who deserve the same respect that would be shown to any soldier serving their country. Most importantly, Marcus found peace knowing that his story had helped other veterans feel less alone in their struggles with post-traumatic stress and readjustment to civilian life. Letters from fellow soldiers around the world thanked him for showing that it was possible to continue serving with honor even after experiencing the worst that war had to offer. The man who had once stood alone while being mocked by strangers was now surrounded by a community of people who understood his worth and appreciated his sacrifice. Marcus had found his place in a world that finally recognized him not as entertainment, but as the genuine hero he had always been. Sarah Harrison knew that what she had just recorded was much more than a simple tourist video. Her journalism training had taught her to recognize when she was witnessing something newsworthy and important. The powerful speech her grandfather had given defending the palace guard was exactly the kind of content that could make a real difference in how people understood military service and sacrifice. As soon as George finished speaking, Sarah began researching Marcus' background, using the information she could see on his uniform. His name tag was clearly visible, and the specific military decorations he wore provided clues about his service record. Within minutes of searching on her phone, she had found detailed information about Sergeant Marcus Thompson and his remarkable military career. The research revealed that Marcus had indeed served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, as George had suggested. Sarah discovered that he had been awarded the Silver Star for exceptional gallantry during a mission where he had single-handedly held off enemy forces for 4 hours while civilians evacuated from a village under attack. The official military records showed that his actions had directly saved 37 innocent lives. Sarah also found information about Marcus' Purple Heart, which had been awarded after he was wounded during the same heroic action that earned him the Silver Star. Additional research revealed other commendations for bravery, leadership, and dedication to protecting both his fellow soldiers and innocent civilians caught in combat zones. While Sarah was researching Marcus' background, she was also uploading the video of her grandfather defending him to her social media accounts. She wrote a detailed caption explaining what the video showed and included the information she had discovered about Marcus' true identity as a decorated war hero rather than just a ceremonial guard. The video began spreading across social media platforms faster than Sarah had ever seen any of her previous posts shared. Within the first hour, it had been viewed thousands of times, and the numbers kept growing exponentially as people shared it with their own followers and friends. Comments began pouring in from viewers who were outraged by the treatment Marcus had received. Many of the comments came from military veterans who recognized the signs of post-traumatic stress that Marcus had been displaying during the harassment. They shared their own stories of struggling to readjust to civilian life after combat deployments. Some veterans wrote long, heartfelt messages thanking Sarah for standing up for a fellow soldier who was suffering in silence. Military families also began sharing the video and adding their own comments about the sacrifices that service members make for their countries. Wives, mothers, and children of soldiers wrote about how difficult it was to watch their loved ones struggle with invisible wounds from combat experiences that most civilians could never understand or relate to. The original videos that the college students had recorded of their harassment now took on a completely different meaning. What had seemed like harmless fun when they posted it online was now being viewed as cruel treatment of a war hero who deserved respect and gratitude. The students began receiving angry messages from people who demanded they remove their content and apologize. News organizations started picking up the story as the video continued going viral across multiple social media platforms. Reporters reached out to Sarah asking for permission to use her video and requesting interviews with her grandfather about his defense of Marcus. The story was becoming much bigger than anyone had expected. Military advocacy groups began sharing the video as an example of how veterans are often misunderstood and mistreated by civilians who do not appreciate their service and sacrifice. The video became a rallying point for discussions about supporting veterans' mental health and treating all service members with the dignity they deserve. British government officials also took notice of the story as it spread throughout the country and internationally. Members of Parliament began discussing the treatment of military personnel and the need for better public education about veteran issues. The video had sparked conversations about respect and understanding that reached the highest levels of government. Within 24 hours of Sarah uploading her grandfather's speech, the video had been viewed millions of times and shared by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. The story of Marcus Thompson had become an international symbol of both military heroism and the importance of treating veterans with the respect and support they deserve after their service to their countries. Sarah Harrison knew that what she had just recorded was much more than a simple tourist video. Her journalism training had taught her to recognize when she was witnessing something newsworthy and important. The powerful speech her grandfather had given defending the palace guard was exactly the kind of content that could make a real difference in how people understood military service and sacrifice. As soon as George finished speaking, Sarah began researching Marcus' background using the information she could see on his uniform. His name tag was clearly visible, and the specific military decorations he wore provided clues about his service record. Within minutes of searching on her phone, she had found detailed information about Sergeant Marcus Thompson and his remarkable military career. The research revealed that Marcus had indeed served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, as George had suggested. Sarah discovered that he had been awarded the Silver Star for exceptional gallantry during a mission where he had single-handedly held off enemy forces for 4 hours while civilians evacuated from a village under attack. The official military records showed that his actions had directly saved 37 innocent lives. Sarah also found information about Marcus' Purple Heart, which had been awarded after he was wounded during the same heroic action that earned him the Silver Star. Additional research revealed other commendations for bravery, leadership, and dedication to protecting both his fellow soldiers and innocent civilians caught in combat zones. While Sarah was researching Marcus' background, she was also uploading the video of her grandfather defending him to her social media accounts. She wrote a detailed caption explaining what the video showed and included the information she had discovered about Marcus' true identity as a decorated war hero rather than just a ceremonial guard. The video began spreading across social media platforms faster than Sarah had ever seen any of her previous posts shared. Within the first hour, it had been viewed thousands of times, and the numbers kept growing exponentially as people shared it with their own followers and friends. Comments began pouring in from viewers who were outraged by the treatment Marcus had received. Many of the comments came from military veterans who recognized the signs of post-traumatic stress that Marcus had been displaying during the harassment. They shared their own stories of struggling to readjust to civilian life after combat deployments. Some veterans wrote long, heartfelt messages thanking Sarah for standing up for a fellow soldier who was suffering in silence. Military families also began sharing the video and adding their own comments about the sacrifices that service members make for their countries. Wives, mothers, and children of soldiers wrote about how difficult it was to watch their loved ones struggle with invisible wounds from combat experiences that most civilians could never understand or relate to. The original videos that the college students had recorded of their harassment now took on a completely different meaning. What had seemed like harmless fun when they posted it online was now being viewed as cruel treatment of a war hero who deserved respect and gratitude. The students began receiving angry messages from people who demanded they remove their content and apologize. News organizations started picking up the story as the video continued going viral across multiple social media platforms. Reporters reached out to Sarah, asking for permission to use her video and requesting interviews with her grandfather about his defense of Marcus. The story was becoming much bigger than anyone had expected. Military advocacy groups began sharing the video as an example of how veterans are often misunderstood and mistreated by civilians who do not appreciate their service and sacrifice. The video became a rallying point for discussions about supporting veterans' mental health and treating all service members with the dignity they deserve. British government officials also took notice of the story as it spread throughout the country and internationally. Members of Parliament began discussing the treatment of military personnel and the need for better public education about veteran issues. The video had sparked conversations about respect and understanding that reached the highest levels of government. Within 24 hours of Sarah uploading her grandfather's speech, the video had been viewed millions of times and shared by hundreds of thousands of people around the world. The story of Marcus Thompson had become an international symbol of both military heroism and the importance of treating veterans with the respect and support they deserve after their service to their countries. Among the crowd of tourists who had gathered to watch the harassment was an elderly man who saw what others had missed. George Harrison was 82 years old and had traveled to London from his home in Manchester to visit the city with his granddaughter Sarah. He walked slowly with the help of a carved wooden cane that had belonged to his father before him. George had served in World War II as a young soldier fighting against Nazi forces across Europe. He had experienced combat in France, Belgium, and Germany during some of the most brutal battles of the entire war. After returning home, he had struggled for decades with what doctors now call post-traumatic stress disorder, but in his time was simply known as shell shock. As George watched Marcus standing rigidly at his post, he recognized signs that most people would never notice. The way the guard held his shoulders, the controlled breathing pattern, the distant look in his eyes that seemed to be seeing something far beyond the present moment. These were all symptoms that George knew intimately from his own long battle with war trauma. Sarah Harrison was 24 years old and studying journalism at university. She had brought her grandfather to London as a graduation present and was enjoying showing him the famous sights of the capital city. But she was becoming increasingly uncomfortable with the behavior of the American tourists, who seemed to think harassing the palace guard was acceptable entertainment. George had been watching the situation develop for several minutes, and his anger was growing with each passing moment. He remembered how difficult it had been for him to readjust to civilian life after the war. He remembered the nightmares and flashbacks that had plagued him for years. Most importantly, he remembered how much it had meant when people showed him respect and understanding rather than mockery and cruelty. The sound of the firecracker had made George flinch involuntarily as his own memories of explosions and gunfire briefly surfaced. But he quickly realized that the young guard was having a much more severe reaction to the noise. George could see the signs of a panic attack beginning, and he knew that the situation was about to become much more serious. Sarah noticed her grandfather tightening his grip on his walking cane and saw the determined expression that crossed his weathered face. She had seen that look before when her grandfather felt strongly about standing up for what was right. She quickly pulled out her phone and began recording because her journalistic instincts told her that something important was about to happen. George began walking toward the group of college students with steady, determined steps. His cane tapped firmly against the cobblestones as he approached, and his voice carried the authority of someone who had commanded respect for 8 decades of life. The students were so focused on their harassment of Marcus that they did not notice the elderly man approaching until he was standing directly beside them. When George finally spoke, his voice was loud enough for everyone in the immediate area to hear clearly. The tone was firm and commanding in a way that made people stop what they were doing and pay attention. Sarah continued filming as her grandfather prepared to confront the group of tourists who had no idea what they were about to face. Other people in the crowd began turning toward George as they sensed that something significant was happening. A few other elderly visitors nodded approvingly as they recognized a fellow veteran who was about to defend someone who could not defend himself. The atmosphere around Marcus Post began to shift as more people became aware of the confrontation that was developing. George positioned himself directly between the college students and Marcus, effectively blocking their access to the guard. He planted his cane firmly on the ground and straightened his back to his full height. Despite his advanced age, there was still something commanding and intimidating about his presence that made the younger people take notice. The students looked confused and slightly annoyed at this interruption of their entertainment. They had no idea who this old man was or why he thought he had the right to interfere with their fun. But they were about to learn a lesson about respect and sacrifice that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. George took a deep breath and prepared to deliver words that would not only defend Marcus, but also educate everyone present about the true meaning of service and sacrifice. Marcus' mind was trapped between 2 different worlds, and he was fighting the most difficult battle of his entire life. On one side was the present moment where he stood guard at Buckingham Palace, surrounded by laughing tourists on a peaceful afternoon. On the other side were the horrific memories of Afghanistan, where explosions meant death, and every second could be his last. The sound of the firecracker continued echoing in his head long after the actual noise had faded away. In his mind, Marcus could hear the whistle of incoming rockets and the rapid fire of machine guns. He could smell the smoke and dust from collapsed buildings. He could feel the intense heat from burning vehicles and the weight of his combat gear pressing down on his shoulders. His body remained perfectly still in his ceremonial position, but inside every nerve was screaming. His military training had taught him to maintain discipline under the most extreme circumstances, but this internal war was testing every limit of his mental strength and endurance. Marcus could see the faces of his fallen comrades as clearly as if they were standing right in front of him. Johnson, who had died from an explosion, just like the firecracker. Rodriguez, who had been shot while trying to save a wounded child. Williams, who had stepped on a hidden mine while clearing a path for escaping civilians. The guilt that Marcus carried was almost unbearable. He had survived when better men had died. He had come home to safety while his brothers in arms had been buried in foreign soil thousands of miles from their families. The question of why he had been spared haunted him every single day since returning from his final deployment. His breathing became more labored as the panic attack intensified. Marcus had learned techniques from military doctors to help manage his post-traumatic stress, but those methods were difficult to use while maintaining his guard duties. He could not close his eyes or move to a quiet place or use any of the coping strategies that usually helped him through these episodes. The tourists continued their cruel entertainment, completely unaware that they were watching a decorated war hero fight for his sanity. They saw his increased tension and sweating as signs that their harassment was finally working. This encouraged them to become even more aggressive in their attempts to break his professional composure. Marcus' hands were trembling slightly at his sides, but he forced them to remain in the proper position required by palace protocol. Every instinct in his body was telling him to reach for his weapon and scan for threats, but he knew that no such dangers existed in this peaceful setting. The battle was entirely in his mind, but it felt just as real as any combat he had experienced. The worst part was feeling completely alone and helpless. In Afghanistan, Marcus had been part of a team where everyone looked out for each other. If one soldier was struggling, the others would provide support and assistance. But now he was isolated and surrounded by people who saw him as an object rather than a human being who needed help. Marcus tried to focus on his breathing and use mental exercises to bring himself back to the present moment. He reminded himself that he was in London, not Afghanistan. He was safe and the explosions were just memories that could not hurt him anymore. But his traumatized mind refused to accept these logical thoughts. The college students were now taking turns posing for photos next to the visibly distressed guard. They made victory signs and smiled broadly while Marcus continued fighting his invisible battle just inches away from them. Their complete lack of empathy and understanding made the situation even more painful for him to endure. Minutes felt like hours as Marcus waited for the panic attack to pass. He had experienced these episodes many times since returning from deployment, but they never became easier to handle. Each one felt like he was reliving the worst day of his life all over again with the same intensity and terror that had nearly destroyed him the first time. The American college students were growing bored with their attempts to make Marcus react. They had been harassing him for over an hour now, and their silly faces and mocking marches were not getting the dramatic response they wanted for their social media videos. Brad wiped sweat from his forehead and looked around at his friends with frustration clearly showing on his face. Jessica continued filming with her phone, but even she was starting to realize that this content might not be as entertaining as she had hoped. The views and likes she expected were not going to come from a guard who simply refused to break his professional composure no matter what they did to him. Tyler had an idea that he thought would finally get a reaction from the stoic guard. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a small package that he had been saving for a special occasion during their European vacation. It was a firecracker that he had purchased from a street vendor in another country, where such things were legal and easy to buy. The other students gathered around Tyler as he showed them the small explosive device. They whispered excitedly among themselves about their plan to finally make the serious guard jump or show some kind of reaction. They had no idea that what they were about to do would trigger something far more serious than they could have imagined. Brad encouraged Tyler to go ahead with the plan while Jessica positioned herself to capture everything on video. They were convinced that this would be the moment that would make their social media post go viral and give them the attention they were seeking from their online followers. Tyler lit the fuse of the small firecracker and tossed it casually near Marcus' feet. The students stepped back slightly and waited with anticipation for the guard to finally break his ceremonial pose. They expected him to jump or look startled, which would give them the perfect reaction shot for their video. The sharp crack of the exploding firecracker echoed off the palace walls and surrounding buildings. To the students, it was just a harmless prank that made a loud noise. But to Marcus, the sound was something entirely different and infinitely more dangerous to his mental state. In that instant, Marcus was no longer standing guard at Buckingham Palace on a peaceful Tuesday afternoon. The sound of the explosion transported him back to that terrible day in the Afghan mountains when his world had been filled with gunfire and death. His mind could not distinguish between the harmless firecracker and the deadly explosions that had nearly killed him and his fellow soldiers. Marcus' body went rigid as every muscle tensed in preparation for combat. His breathing became rapid and shallow as his heart rate spiked to dangerous levels. The familiar smell of gunpowder filled his nostrils and brought back memories that he had been trying to keep buried deep in his subconscious mind. The tourists around him had no idea what they were witnessing. They saw a guard who suddenly looked more tense and alert, but they did not understand that Marcus was experiencing a severe episode of post-traumatic stress disorder. His mind was fighting a battle between past and present, while his body remained frozen in place by his training and discipline. Sweat began forming on Marcus' forehead, despite the cool London air. His hands wanted to reach for weapons that were not there. His instincts screamed at him to take cover or return fire, but his conscious mind knew that he was supposed to remain at his ceremonial post, no matter what happened around him. The college students began laughing and celebrating because they thought their prank had finally gotten some kind of reaction from the stubborn guard. They had no understanding that they had just caused serious psychological harm to a man who had already suffered more than any person should have to endure. What the laughing tourists could never have imagined was the incredible story behind the man they were mocking. Marcus Thompson was not just another ceremonial guard trying to earn an easy paycheck. He was a decorated war hero whose courage and sacrifice had saved dozens of lives in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. 3 years earlier, Marcus had been serving as a sergeant in the British Special Forces deep in the mountains of Afghanistan. He had volunteered for his third tour of duty, when most soldiers would have chosen to stay home with their families. But Marcus felt a strong sense of duty to protect innocent people who were caught in the middle of a brutal conflict. His unit was known as one of the most elite fighting forces in the entire British military. They were called in for the missions that regular soldiers could not handle: rescue operations behind enemy lines, protecting villages from terrorist attacks, gathering intelligence in areas where one wrong step could mean death or capture. Marcus had earned the respect of every man in his unit through his fearless leadership and quick thinking under pressure. When bullets were flying and explosions were shaking the ground around them, Marcus remained calm and focused. His fellow soldiers trusted him completely because he had proven time and again that he would risk everything to bring them all home safely. The worst day of Marcus' life came during what was supposed to be a routine mission to evacuate civilians from a remote mountain village. Intelligence reports had suggested the area was clear of enemy forces, but as Marcus and his team approached the village in their armored vehicles, everything went wrong in an instant. Hidden fighters opened fire from multiple positions surrounding the village. The first explosion flipped one of the military vehicles and trapped 2 soldiers inside. Marcus could hear their screams for help as flames began spreading through the wreckage. Without hesitation, he ran directly into the line of fire to pull his wounded comrades to safety. But the ambush was much larger than anyone had expected. Enemy fighters had been planning this attack for weeks, and they had positioned themselves perfectly to trap the British forces. Marcus realized that his small unit was vastly outnumbered and surrounded with no easy way to escape. The village was filled with innocent families, including dozens of children who were now caught in the middle of a deadly firefight. Marcus made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life, but also save countless innocent lives. He ordered his remaining team members to begin evacuating the civilians while he stayed behind to hold off the attackers. For 4 hours, Marcus fought alone against overwhelming odds. He moved from building to building using every skill he had learned in years of combat training. His rifle grew hot from constant firing, and his ammunition supplies ran dangerously low. But he refused to retreat because he knew that every minute he held the enemy back gave more families time to escape to safety. The sound of gunfire echoed through the mountain valleys as Marcus engaged enemy positions one by one. He was hit twice by rifle bullets, but the wounds were not serious enough to stop him from fighting. Pain meant nothing when innocent lives depended on his actions. By the time reinforcements finally arrived, Marcus had single-handedly eliminated over 20 enemy fighters and allowed 37 civilians to escape certain death. His uniform was torn and bloody, and his body was pushed beyond its limits. But every person in that village owed their life to his incredible courage and determination. The military awarded Marcus the Silver Star for exceptional gallantry in combat. He also received the Purple Heart for his wounds and several other medals recognizing his heroic service. But the nightmares and flashbacks from that terrible day followed him home when his tour of duty finally ended. Now, as he stood guard at Buckingham Palace, those memories remained locked away in his mind like ghosts that refused to rest in peace. The afternoon sun climbed higher as more tourists filled the area around Buckingham Palace. Marcus had been standing at his post for several hours now, and his legs were beginning to feel the strain. But his military training had prepared him for much worse conditions than this. He remained perfectly still with his eyes focused straight ahead, as required by palace protocol. A group of 5 American college students approached his position with their phones already recording. They were clearly looking for entertainment and had heard stories about trying to make the palace guards react. The leader of the group was a tall young man named Brad who wore an expensive baseball cap and designer sunglasses. His friends followed behind him, giggling and encouraging his behavior. Brad walked right up to Marcus and stood just inches from his face. He began making silly expressions and funny faces, trying to get the guard to crack a smile or show any reaction at all. Marcus could smell the beer on the young man's breath and realized they had been drinking despite the early hour. When Marcus showed no response, Brad became more bold. He started waving his hands directly in front of Marcus' face, moving them back and forth like he was trying to hypnotize him. His friends found this hilarious, and their laughter grew louder, attracting attention from other tourists who stopped to watch the show. A girl in the group named Jessica pulled out her phone and started filming everything. She had over 50,000 followers on social media and knew this content would get lots of views and likes. She encouraged Brad to do something even more outrageous for her video. Brad began doing exaggerated military marches around Marcus, making fun of the way soldiers walk and move. He stomped his feet heavily and swung his arms in ridiculous motions while his friends cheered him on. Other tourists started gathering to watch, and some began recording their own videos of the harassment. The mockery continued to escalate as the group grew more confident. Another student named Tyler decided to join in by making loud military commands at Marcus. He shouted things like "attention" and "at ease" in a mocking tone while pretending to be a drill sergeant. The group found this even funnier, and their behavior became more disrespectful. Marcus remained completely motionless throughout all of this, but inside he was fighting a battle. His military training had taught him discipline and self-control, but these tourists were testing every limit of his patience. He could feel his jaw clenching slightly, but forced himself to relax and maintain his professional composure. Jessica moved closer with her phone, trying to get the perfect angle for her social media post. She began making comments about how the guard looked too serious and probably had no sense of humor. She suggested that he was probably too scared to be a real soldier, and that was why he had such an easy job just standing around looking pretty. The insults cut deeper than the students realized. They had no idea that Marcus had volunteered for some of the most dangerous military missions possible. They did not know that he had risked his life countless times to protect people just like them. To them, he was just entertainment, and they felt entitled to treat him however they wanted. Brad decided to try something new. He pretended to trip and fall dramatically right in front of Marcus, expecting some kind of reaction or concern. When Marcus did not move or acknowledge the fake accident, Brad got frustrated. He called Marcus names, suggesting he was stupid or broken. The harassment continued for nearly 30 minutes while palace security remained at a distance. The guards were trained to handle tourist behavior, and intervention was only required in extreme cases. But Marcus was beginning to wonder if this situation might cross that line, as the group showed no signs of stopping their cruel behavior. Other tourists watched with mixed reactions. Some found it entertaining, while others looked uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. But nobody spoke up to defend Marcus or ask the students to stop their harassment of a person who was simply trying to do his job with dignity and honor. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as Marcus Thompson took his position for the first time. His red uniform was perfectly pressed, and his black bearskin hat sat precisely on his head, just like the regulation books demanded. But something about Marcus was different from the other guards who stood at their posts around the famous palace. At 28 years old, Marcus was much older than most new recruits who usually started this job in their early 20s. His face carried lines that spoke of experiences far beyond his years. While other guards maintained their ceremonial poses with natural ease, Marcus seemed to carry an invisible burden that weighed heavily on his broad shoulders. The tourists began arriving early that Tuesday morning, just as they did every single day. Families with excited children pointed cameras toward the palace gates. Couples posed for romantic photos with the iconic red guards in the background. Tour groups gathered around their guides, who shared stories about the royal family and British traditions. But Marcus caught their attention in a way that was different from the other guards. His brown eyes remained fixed straight ahead, as required by his training, but there was something deeper there. Something that made people look twice. His jaw was set in a way that suggested he had seen things that most people never would. His stance was not just ceremonial but genuinely alert, as if he was always ready for real danger. A group of teenagers from Germany approached his post first. They giggled and whispered among themselves in their native language while taking selfies. One brave girl stepped closer to Marcus and waved her hand near his face, trying to get him to blink or smile. Marcus remained perfectly still, but those who were watching carefully might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes. An elderly British woman walking her small dog paused near Marcus and studied his face with concern. She had lived through World War II and had learned to recognize the look of someone who had seen combat. There was something in Marcus that reminded her of her late husband when he returned from fighting in France. The same distant gaze, the same invisible weight. More tourists gathered as the morning progressed. American college students on their European adventure started making jokes about the serious-looking guard. They had heard stories about how these palace guards never moved or reacted, no matter what tourists did. They saw it as a fun challenge, rather than understanding the discipline and training it required. Marcus could hear their comments, but his military training had taught him to remain focused on his duty regardless of distractions. He had stood guard in much more dangerous places where a moment of lost concentration could mean the difference between life and death. This ceremonial duty at Buckingham Palace was supposed to be peaceful and safe, but his mind and body remained on high alert out of habit. The morning air was crisp and cool, but Marcus felt warm under his heavy uniform. His hands remained perfectly positioned at his sides, even though they wanted to move. His breathing was controlled and steady, even though memories sometimes tried to surface and disturb his calm exterior. A French family approached next with their 2 young children, who stared up at Marcus with wide, curious eyes. The little boy asked his father in broken English why the guard looked so sad. The father shushed his son and pulled the family away for photos with a different guard who seemed more approachable. As the hours passed, Marcus began to understand that his new role would bring its own unique challenges. The tourists saw him as entertainment or decoration, rather than as a person with his own story and struggles. They had no idea what he had been through or why he had chosen this particular job after everything he had experienced. The changing of the guard ceremony was still hours away, but Marcus knew that every minute until then would test his ability to remain professional while dealing with the curious and sometimes disrespectful behavior of visitors who saw palace guards as objects rather than human beings.